back to the question of the we. Who is the we who are in debt? Who is the we of society? And so in my book, I kept coming back to what I thought was a dialectical relationship between solidarity and indebtedness. I had different figures of speech to try to talk about the relationship of those two things, but I began to think that one of the best ways to understand indebtedness is to look at all the actual forms of debt that people get caught up in. You could look at the Debt Resisters Manual for a list of examples, and to imagine how all of those are various forms of negative or failed forms of solidarity. So we become indebted in mortgages because we don't have solidarity with the local housing. We become indebted with credit cards because our basic necessities as well as our luxuries aren't being addressed in some common form. So the dialectic of indebtedness and solidarity seems important. So very quickly, I'm going to give you 2 Gramscian boxes. The first one is to just use the title of this show. To have and to own generates 2 more positions. To not owe and to not have. Now, in what sense is this so? Looks like this, right? Now, in what sense what does this start to tell us? The Gramscian box is nothing if it doesn't start giving us ideas. Well, that's interesting. What does that mean? So how do we gloss these terms? Well, to have is obviously a gloss of something like ownership, right? If you have something, you own something, or you possess it. It's property. To owe is obviously indebtedness. What is to not owe then? And why is that different from having? Well, to not owe might mean something like autonomy. It doesn't necessarily mean you have something, but it means that you don't owe something. And to not have is obviously something like poverty. So now we have 4 possible positions. And each of us could imagine where we stand in this scheme if we were going to sort ourselves out in different corners of the room. Which of us have, in the sense that we own stuff? Which of us are indebted? Which of us are not indebted in that sense but are autonomous? And which of us don't have poverty? Now, as soon as you lay it out this way, you see, I'm not sure how far you go with this, but you see the problem of credit doesn't appear anywhere here. Where does credit come from? Well, in this model, insofar as it models something about the way we think of economic relationships, credit is only a modification of the state of ownership. Right? Credit doesn't have an independent existence. It may or may not exist. Right? So in that sense, to have and to owe excludes what we might call the elements of generosity or sharing or reciprocity that we might have thought a society would require. So in that sense, this looks like an interestingly closed ideological box. So reciprocity would occur only as a resolution of the initial contradiction, whereas the negation of the bottom terms, is there a relationship between autonomy and poverty? No. That's precisely no relationship. In a society in which it's possible for some people to be autonomous, self-sufficient, and other people to be permanently lacking, there's no social relation. And obviously, the terms on this side, ownership and autonomy, point to some kind of accumulation. And the terms on this side, indebtedness and poverty, point to some kind of destitution. So, in other words, what this presents, just in a quick, heuristic way, is a different way of modeling what we might otherwise resort to a language of sociological class or economic position or something, right? Suddenly, having and owing generates a different way of sorting out the social field. So here we have personal interests. We have public interests. And stop and think about this. Maybe I'm astonished by the most obvious things, but when you pay your taxes, you owe the money to the state. What does the state owe you in return? I don't know. It's not really spelled out anywhere, right? But something. I assume that political theorists have this all worked out, that the legitimacy of the state is grounded on an implicit assumption that the state will pay back something, whether it's protection, whether it's provision, something like that. So, those words seem to cover a lot of ground. Now, because we're following the Gramscian method, we now have the problem of thinking, what is a not public debt, and what is a not private debt? These possibilities are logically inscribed in the initial opposition, even if historically they take some time to develop. It's my argument in The Bonds of Debt that the current regime of indebtedness, however we want to date this, the situation we find ourselves in now, is where the old assumptions of some kind of equilibrium between private and public forms of debt have been displaced by these secondary forms. And these are hard for me to describe, but let me crack at it. By not private debt, what I think I mean is something like the way in which we are now all encouraged to undertake private debt for public goods. And that formula covers everything from the fact that we're expected to take out loans for our education, we're expected to go into debt to deal with our health care, we're expected to take out debt to cover all of the forms of implicit public provision that were formerly handled at this level, but now are displaced onto the private level, where clearly we can't handle it, right? Private individuals are unable to provide the goods that were formerly furnished through public means. So I call this exposure. We all become exposed. And by exposure, I mean, for those of you who read lots of the contemporary theory, I mean something like the status of bare life that people like Giorgio Agamben talk about. There's a point in which living in this economy exposes us to more dangers and risks than we're capable of